Does improving your mobility further your ability to build strength or muscle mass? That's a question that I get asked all the time. So people will come to one of my in-person classes or do one of my online Kinstretch classes, and they'll come into that class thinking that Kinstretch is just a stretching class. And then they realize that we're actually doing strength work throughout the entire class. And as people start to see the types of things that we're working on in those classes, people start to connect the dots, and then they start to ask the question, is this going to improve my performance in this sport or in this exercise or just my performance in the gym or my ability to build strength or muscle mass in the gym? So because I've been answering that question so commonly lately, I've actually come up with a way of explaining it to people using the board game Monopoly. Now, we've all played Monopoly at some point. Whether you loved it or hated it is probably up in the air, but I want you to imagine that you have that Monopoly board in front of you. Now, within that Monopoly board, we've got real estate covering the entire board. And in the board game Monopoly, the goal is to, first access a property. So I first need to land on and access that property. Once I've landed on and accessed that property, I now have the ability to purchase and therefore own that property. Once I've purchased and now own that property, I can now build on that property. So I can put a house there, I can progress that into an apartment, and so on. Now, to look at the human body, let's imagine that our board no longer has real estate and now has our human body on that board, okay? So step one, we first need to access a range of motion or access part of our body. And so to use the shoulder, for example, I want you to think of access as equivalent to workspace or joint space in this example, in that for my shoulder, if I can only access this much shoulder rotation, well, this is now my workspace, and this range of motion speaks to my ability to access my joint. I can only access this much of my joint, therefore I only have this much space to work within, okay? So keep that in mind as we go through this example. So once you land on a spot, i.e. once we access a range of motion, we now have the ability to build control and own that range of motion. So when I say own, I literally mean control it. Start to build neurological control and own it such that we can do whatever we want in that range of motion. We've got control over it, and that range of motion is ours. We can pull our body in and out of that range of motion with no problem. Now, once we've got control over that range of motion, we can now start to build within that range of motion. So now I can start to build strength and build muscle mass within the range of motion that I can now access and now control. So if you again imagine that board as your human body, if you have limited mobility, that tells us you've only got access to a small portion of that board. Therefore, you can only build within that small portion of that board. But if we can get you more access to more of that board and then get you to control all of those ranges of motion, we can then start to build tissue and build strength within that range of motion. So just like in Monopoly, how you cannot build on a property that you have not accessed and do not own, when it comes to the human body, you cannot build, again, tissue or strength within range of motion that you cannot access and that you do not own. Okay, so that's what we do in mobility training. We work to access range of motion, we work to control that range of motion, and then we work to build strength and build muscle mass within that range of motion. Muscle mass is optional, that's up to you. But I hope that answers some questions. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions about that, don't hesitate to reach out. You can put them in the comments below or just DM me.